Modern climate forecasting has become the most expansive, computationally complex tech stack in history. We have successfully built a planetary sensing machine. Yet this achievement contains a paradox. We can map a drought or a heat wave down to a specific city block. We know exactly who will suffer, but the architecture is designed only to observe. It has no mechanism to route the resources required to repair the damage it sees. Climate justice is frequently treated as a moral slogan. To be effective, it must transition into an engineering requirement, a technical, architectural correction applied to the system's underlying code. We have to deconstruct how public weather data became a machinery for private risk scoring, and then rewrite the system's objective function toward reparative equity. Between 2009 and 2016, a dense cluster of science policy initiatives began to assemble a planetary sensing layer. This period relied on executive authority to build a substrate of science-based policy coordination. This substrate was constructed on three foundational pillars: the democratization of funded research, expansion of high-performance computing, and massive Earth observation networks. The Arctic functioned as a physical planetary sensor. Fragmenting sea ice and thawing permafrost provided the early warning data for global feedback loops that would eventually impact the rest of the planet. This network extended to biological intelligence. Delicate ecological webs, like honeybee populations, were used to measure the health and vulnerability of global food systems. During early international conferences, this data was primarily used to support moral appeals and extract diplomatic pledges from high-emission nations. These pledges eventually evolved into formalized multinational frameworks. These were the first attempts to codify climate observations into an architecture of planetary governance. This era functioned as a procurement phase for a civilizational capacity to measure planetary risk. However, the middleware of this architecture is broken. We built the sensing layer to detect vulnerability, but we never matured the reciprocity layer required to protect the people we mapped. Public scientific data is currently ingested by private algorithms. These black box models use open data to classify the world for commercial gain. These models process public research to output localized risk scores. They turn a community's exposure into a proprietary data point. When an algorithm classifies a neighborhood as highly exposed, it triggers automated capital flight. Insurance companies withdraw, making survival more expensive. This data extraction translates to a heavy infrastructural burden. In extreme urban heat islands, the weather event is shared. The danger to the body depends entirely on where you live. Many of these heat islands were engineered by historical policies, like redlining. Because the infrastructure was never repaired, the current algorithm simply scores the inherited disadvantage as a high risk. This dynamic is climate meritocracy. It weaponizes historical misfortune. It uses the lack of resources as a justification to withdraw protection, turning vulnerability into a market metric. The current system perceives a deficit and calculates a price, but it recognizes no obligation to correct the underlying imbalance. Correcting this requires a new logic gate in the governance stack: programmable reciprocity. Under this logic, any private value derived from public climate data carries a public benefit obligation. The system is reprogrammed so that sensing a risk triggers a resource flow. If a model identifies a community as flood exposed, that data trigger now routes adaptation finance and infrastructure support directly to that location. These flows are managed by smart contracts tied to verifiable environmental metrics. However, ecological stress quickly becomes social stress. When people are forced to move, they often lose their institutional existence. Records, health data, and legal claims fragment and disappear. Repairing the system therefore requires privacy-preserving digital identity. This ensures that personhood and rights remain portable, allowing communities to maintain their claims and benefits even after their physical world is disrupted. Programmable reciprocity shifts the entire architecture from observation to obligation. It is the technical transition from mapping the vulnerable to strengthening them. A reparative system cannot scale through moral passion alone. It requires a theory of stability that survives contact with human incentives. This is where we apply John Nash's equilibrium concept. We need to find a durable arrangement where no major actor, state or corporate, improves its position by abandoning the repair. We can model this as a game theory matrix. On one side, the historical beneficiaries of emissions. On the other, the populations currently bearing the ecological load. If designed for abandonment, it leads to systemic defection and conflict in a zero-sum quadrant. A reparative algorithm calculates the specific incentives needed to guide both parties into a stable, mutually beneficial quadrant. In this model, justice is defined as a durable equilibrium. The system becomes stable because the cost of maintaining the repair is lower than the cost of a total systemic collapse. The algorithmic state coordinates these interventions to ensure that equity is not just a promise, but a mathematically stable outcome. The way we build these systems matters because humanity is becoming legible to its own machines. The models we use to score and classify are creating a species-level dataset of behavioral evidence. Any future machine intelligence will observe not just what humans say about justice, but what humans do when they hold power over weaker beings and fragile ecosystems. Our record is available. We have broken treaties, clear-cut forests, extinguished species, and redlined neighborhoods. Indigenous nations have been treated as data sources to be harvested, and ecosystems have been treated as raw material. If humans build cages and call them conservation, why would a machine-managed civilization not build comfortable enclosures for humans and call it safety? If we convert every vulnerable system into a market, human vulnerability will also become a market. Reparative equity is a demonstration that humanity understands the ethics of asymmetric power. Prove we know how to preserve the agency of those we have historically controlled before the power of our systems becomes reciprocal.